Hey folks, I want to begin the tutorial by stating that this month's sew-along design is my all-time favourite. This wall hanging has the power to brighten up your day by just looking at it. The sheer beauty is immense. Everyone involved in bringing this design to life really has done an amazing job. With a big smile on my face, I would like to introduce the Tree of Life wall hanging. The wall hanger comes with 5 different blocks and can be made in the 4x4, 5x5, 6x6 and the 7x7 hoops. In this video tutorial, I will show you the stitch out of the treetop block and the construction of the wall hanging. We also recommend that you follow our photographed written instructions while completing your wall hanging. And just a quick note before we start, our wall hanging is only an example of how the finished design can look. Here at Sweepy, we encourage everyone's own creativity. Remember to like and subscribe. On that note, let's get this beauty started. Begin by hooping up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto your machine. Then place batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch down. When we are laying down batting, we use the pink thing to keep it lying flat so it doesn't bunch up under the needle. Once stitched down, remove the hoop from your machine and trim the batting about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching using your applique scissors. Next, place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line, and stitch down. Embroider the stippling on the background. Stitch the placement line for the tree. Place fabric B right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line, and stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Leave the fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting on the trunk, then continue to embroider satin stitch around the trunk. The next step is to embroider the placement lines for the leaves. We will now stitch down the fabric for the leaves one at a time. Follow the diagram on the screen for the step order. Place small pieces of fabric right side up on top of the hoop, covering the relevant placement line. Stitch down and trim. Continue same process until all 9 leaves are stitched down. Now embroider the satin stitches around the leaves. You have now completed the stitch out of the treetop block. Remove your work from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch using a rotary cutter and ruler. Here you have the completed block. Hold aside and follow the instructions for the remaining blocks you want to make. Great work everyone! I will now show you how to construct the Tree of Life hanger. First, lay out your wall hanging in the order you would like. Ours is just an example. Take the first 2 blocks and place them right sides together. Pin along one edge, lining up the border stitching the best you can. Take your time with this process. Take the pin blocks over to your sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam, sewing just inside the border lines already on the panels. Continue this until you have joined the remaining blocks in that row together. Open the seams and iron them flat. Then continue this until you have each horizontal row of blocks joined. Next, join the horizontal rows to each other by placing the first 2 rows right sides together. Pin along that bottom edge, lining up your seams and matching up any satin stitches. Move over to your sewing machine and stitch the seams. You can tack stitch to line up your points before sewing down the whole seam. Continue this until you have joined all the horizontal rows together. Open out the stitch seams and iron flat. Trim all the edges so they are straight. Beautiful, folks. The wall hanger is really starting to take shape now. This next step is attaching the flat piping and borders. The flat piping is optional. First, measure the joined blocks, allowing for 1 inch overlapping each side of the blocks. Then go ahead and cut 2 1.5 inch strips of fabric for the flat piping on the sides. The flat piping strips should not have any joins in them, as this will cause them to look uneven when finished. With your iron, press the strips of flat fabric for the piping in half widthways, ensuring the raw edges are sitting exactly on top of each other. Lay a flat piping strip on top of the bottom edge of the right side of the joined blocks, with the folded edge pointing towards the center of the background fabric. Pin or quilt clip together. Stitch into place with a 1/4 inch seam. Repeat for the other long edge of your wall hanging. The edges of the flat piping will overlap the ends. Trim back so it's even. Repeat process for the remaining short ends. If you would like borders, first decide how wide you would like them. We made ours 3 inches wide. Now measure one end of the wall hanging and cut 2 strips of border fabric the length you just measured. Then cut 2 pieces of batting to match. Next we are going to secure the batting to the border fabric. This can be done in 2 ways. The first option is to place the border fabric right side up on top of the batting and with a long basting stitch, sew a 1/4 inch from the edge. Basting the long edges together will prevent them from moving. Use a bobbin thread that will stand out for this step. The second option is to lightly spray temporary adhesive to the batting and then lay your fabric right side up on the batting. We chose the second option. Place the wall hanging on top of the border fabric with the attached batting, right sides together, and then pin or clip together. Make sure the edges are lined up evenly. Stitch together with a 1/2 inch seam. Pinning and stitching on the wrong side of the wall hanging means you can make sure you are stitching inside the border line on the front of the wall hanging. This will ensure this line of stitching will not be shown on the front later. If you use basting stitches on your borders, go ahead and remove them now. Trim back the batting from the seam allowance. Repeat for the opposite border. If needed, trim the borders to make them even. After trimming, fold over and iron the side border down neatly. Now we like to top stitch the border for a neat, flat finish. Next, measure one of the side edges without a border, adding the new border width in your measurement. Cut 2 strips of border fabric the length you just measured, then cut 2 pieces of batting to match. Repeat the basting stitch method or use the temporary adhesive spray that we did for the first 2 borders. Place the wall hanging on top of the border with the attached batting, right sides together. Pin and stitch a 1/2 inch seam from the edge. If you use basting stitches on your borders, go ahead and remove them now. Trim back the batting from the seam allowance. Fold over and iron the border down neatly. Then top stitch the border for a neat, flat finish. Repeat for the opposite border. If needed, trim the borders to make them even. Lovely everyone. I will now explain how to add a backing to your Tree of Life hanger. Place your backing fabric wrong side up on top of your work surface. Then place the wall hanging you have just made right side up on top of the backing fabric, wrong sides together. You can lightly spray your backing down to your wall hanging to help the border stay in place while attaching the binding. Place safety pins approximately 4 inches apart across the whole front of the wall hanging, going through all layers. This will keep all layers together while you stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch along some of the longer seams. There is no right or wrong way of selecting these seams. We stitched using an invisible monofilament thread in the needle and a bobbin thread that matched the backing fabric. We do not suggest using invisible thread on both sides, as it tends to unravel over time. We use the Sweet Pea jaws to help us with this task. They are available on sweetpea.com. The stitching around the outer perimeter of the wall hanging has been stitched with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Edge based all the edges around the wall hanging, sandwiching all layers using a 1/4 inch seam with a long stitch. This just helps keeps everything in place when attaching the binding. Once this is done, trim the excess backing fabric so it matches the exact same shape of the wall hanging. Use your own preferred way of adding the binding to the outer edges of your wall hanging, or follow our method of making a binding. To make the binding, measure the length and width of the wall hanging and add them together, and then multiply by 2. Cut a long strip of fabric this length. If you're cutting one piece of fabric this length, add an extra 12 to 16 inches to the length, just to be sure you have enough fabric in the end. Or cut a few strips and join them together with your sewing machine as shown. Add extra length if you are joining strips, about 4 inches per strip. The width is optional, but we usually find 3 inches wide sufficient. Lay the ends of your fabric strips right sides together at a right angle. Pin the 2 pieces of fabric together, keeping the edges matching. Draw a 45-degree angle with a fabric marker. Then sew a diagonal seam from corner to corner. Cut the corner a 1/4 inch from the stitch down. Now iron open the seam. And repeat until all the binding strips are sewn together in one long strip. Once you have joined the fabric into one long strip, fold the whole strip in half, wrong sides together, and iron down. Lay out your binding fabric and unfold one end. Fold that open end of the binding to a 45-degree angle, as shown, and lightly press. Trim your fabric a 1/4 inch from the 45-degree angle fold. Fold the binding strip in half again. Now pin your loops to the desired spots on your hanger. We use 4 loops. so they are evenly spread across the top. See written instructions on how to make the loops. Stay stitch in place. Match the raw edges of the wall hanging and the binding to the desired starting location, with your wall hanging right side up. Start about halfway along one side. Using a ruler, mark 1 inch down from the end of the strip. Mark with a pin. Using a ruler, mark 3 inches down from the 1 inch mark. Mark with a second pin. At this time, we also marked a 2 inch gap above from the first pin. This pin will signal when to stop stitching once we have sewn around the wall hanging. Using a 3/8 of an inch seam, stitch 1 inch of the open fold onto the wall hanging and stop stitching once you get to the 1 inch mark. Then leave a 3 inch gap. This will provide an opening to insert the end of the binding fabric when we have completed the sewing. Then start stitching again at the 3 inch mark. Continue sewing until you reach the first corner and stop stitching 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the end, but keep your needle down. Lift your foot and turn your wall hanging with your needle still down. Continue stitching to the corner. Lift the binding strip over and pull against that angled stitch that we have just made to form a diagonal fold. Then fold the binding strip back down, creating a fold at the top. Pin and start stitching until you reach the side of the wall hanging that you started on, mitering the corners as you go. Stop stitching when you get to the pin that marks the 2 inches from the starting point. Fold up the remaining binding so it sits just above the first 3 inch mark. Trim the excess binding, leaving enough to slip into the fold. Trim 1/8 of an inch or 2 to 3 centimeters off the raw edge of the binding for a good 1 inch or 2 to 3 centimeters. Place the end of the binding fabric into the pocket created at the start of the binding process. Pin in place. Continue to stitch the seam until binding is completely sewn on. Fold back the binding and iron the seams flat. Now turn the wall hanging over so you're working on the back of the wall hanging. We started at the corners of the wall hanging. Fold in one side of the corner just past the stitching and iron well. This will help get a nice pointed corner. Repeat for the other side of the corner, meeting up with the first fold, creating a nice pointed corner. Pin in place. Repeat for all 4 corners of the wall hanging. Then continue folding and pinning the remaining binding to the back of the wall hanging, past the stitching. Start stitching anywhere on the wall hanging from the front using the stitch in the ditch method. When you get to the corner, simply just leave your needle down and lift the foot and rotate the wall hanging. Put your foot down and continue stitching in this fashion until you're right around the wall hanging. Now it's time to fold back the loops for the hanger. Make sure not to pull too tight. We then use our sewing machine to sew a box within the binding allowance to secure. Give it a good press and then you have finished your stunning tree of life wall hanging.